Hello. Welcome to History Chats this afternoon. Yeah, great. Yeah, welcome to History Chats. We're going to get started in just a minute here. Um, yeah, it looks like it's working. Great. That's always a plus. Yeah, so we're going to get started in just a minute here. We are going to be concluding our month of December here. We're looking at the city of Wausau's 150th and anniversary coming to an end this week. And so we're going to be looking at, summing up the history of Wausau. So we've been doing that all week or all month here. And today I'm going to do my best to bring everything together. This is normally where I would tell you about stuff coming up, but we're going to hold off on that for now because we don't have a whole lot coming up yet until the new year. So hope everybody's having a good holiday break or getting some time off or some time to spend time with family and all of that fun stuff, or even by yourself. Hope you're enjoying the holidays. Yeah. Um, I think I'm just gonna jump right into it because not much to talk about. So, hey, I'll just make sure that the audio is decent here. Right, good. Take those off. All right. So like I said, this week we have been looking at the history of Wausau as part of the 150th anniversary, the sesquicentennial of the city charter of Wausau. We've been looking at some of the history through pictures. In fact, we've done a few of them. Here are sort of the zoomed in versions of all of them. Okay. A little distracted there. But yeah, so these are the four that we've kind of done. If you want to know more about the individual ones, you can go back and watch if you haven't seen those. But covering the early lumbering era through the railroad into the 20th century and sort of the modern sort of mid-century into the 1950s, 60s, 70s. And so today we're left with essentially the 1980s to the present, which is an interesting challenge. So I sat down, and obviously there are some very iconic things that we could talk about in the early period, but I wanted to try to do my best to bring it up to the present. And obviously this is always a difficult thing because we are not past a lot of the stuff that has been very typical of the new century, for example, right? Things like the internet and changes that are still having ramifications. We don't have the benefit of hindsight to be able to go back and say, well, here's the importance of this or that. In the same way that I can talk about like the railroad coming to Wausau in the 1870s and 80s. That has some very clear ramifications that we can talk about. But what do we talk about here? So I thought, rather than show you the image and then jump through it, let's start by just talking about like what has Wausau been up to? What is this period from the 1980s to the present? What are the major things? Well, there's a couple things that are happening. The city limits themselves. The city, the land, the footprint, right, of the city starts to expand in interesting ways, and it certainly has expanded during this period. This is the aldermanic districts, which I've never seen as an adjective before, aldermanic, but basically this is the city representatives as of 1981. And you can see that the city of Wausau has kind of started to do this weird kind of snaking around into different areas. In the early years, when a city or a village gets created, gets incorporated, we have the boundaries are kind of set. And what often happens is the city decides to expand. So for example, the city might get pushed out a bit further. The city limits annex a bunch of land from a surrounding township. And then development happens there. And so neighborhoods get thrown in, and as time goes on, that kind of gets developed. Well, in the later half of the 20th century, increasingly the way that Wausau expands, and this is true of many places, but as an example here, Wausau, it's encroaching into areas that have already been developed. And if I bring up, this is if you just type in a city like City of Wausau into Google Maps, it shows you the boundaries. And you can see that, as that Western expansion happens, it's not like we just take a big, the city just takes a big chunk, drawing a line from here out to this period and then, going down. Instead, what we have is weird boundaries, right? Little exclaves and enclaves and little bits. Because what ends up happening is, if there are people already there, um, I mean, this whole bit here is, this the woods over here in between Wausau East and Wausau and Horseman are that's part of the county, I guess. It's not part of the city limits. So what ends up happening is, sorry, I got distracted there for a second. Say over here, right? If Wausau wanted to annex this area, and the idea being that by bringing the city limits to those areas, brings the properties and the businesses and the residents who are living there under the care of a Wausau, then you get the tax revenue from them, as being taxed, which not everybody really wants, to have to pay more taxes. But on the plus side, then you have the benefits of the services and all of the things that Wausau provides are extended to those places. And so what ends up happening is these days, in order to expand into an area, you have to have the majority of the people there vote, yes, everybody has to be on board. And that is not always the case. And so it leads to situations like this where, you know, most of the area is, but rather than try to convince holdouts that don't want to join, or it just doesn't make sense to for whatever reasons, the boundary is just kind of drawn, not in like big, easy round numbers, but just kind of, all right, we'll just go around that property. The point of this is to say that I think, what is the future growth of the city of Wausau? I mean, from the beginning, Wausau has expanded by bringing in new neighborhoods and bringing in new areas, new places where industry is being built. But it's unclear whether that's going to be the case going forward, right? This is the current municipal map, I think pretty current, at least in the last year or two, of the area. And so here's Wausau, again, kind of that, squiggly area. And so the towns are unincorporated, but these are not unincorporated. In this era, the sort of the Wausau area, metro area, Schofield, Rothschild, Weston, Maine, Rib Mountain is looking at incorporating, largely, along like Weston and Maine and Cronenwetter, so that, as Rothschild and Schofield and Wausau are expanding, Mosinee, that important tax base that the Cronenwetter put in the infrastructure to attract businesses, and so to have that being taken up because it's been annexed to Mosinee or Rothschild, not ideal. And so we have, it's going to be harder and harder for a city like Wausau to do what we have been doing for the last century, which is just kind of, taking a bunch of land, because that brings it into being productive. So my point is that I think throughout the 1980s and 90s into the present, I think that there has been some expansion, but it's not the same way. And it's not going to be necessarily the way forward, as other communities are emerging. And I think rightfully so, not everybody wants to join in with Wausau, where they have sort of less autonomy, or the ability to kind of impact what happens in their neighborhood. Maybe it's a good thing, maybe it's a bad thing. It's not for us to decide. But on the other hand, Wausau has been trying to, I think, largely besides the expansion thing, it kind of turns inward. Hey, we need a mall because the downtown area is losing commerce. This is an artist rendering of the project before it was built. But in the 1980s, one of the things that happens in a lot of places is let's try to renovate, let's try to reinvigorate the downtown area in particular. Because it needs help. As more and more people are doing their shopping in department stores and even big box stores, your Walmarts and Shopkos and things like that. Well, they're not downtown anymore. And we have a Sears, we have J.C. Penney's, and these big box store, or larger stores, but maybe, because there's not parking, because it's hard to get people to come in here, we need to find a way to reinvigorate the area in that way. And so, the mall is one, divisive, but ultimately very successful for the time period. way to try to change things. And so, it is very successful, and it opens in 1983, 84. Hey, we're celebrating as the Wausau is the All-America city, right? At the same time, in the 1980s, you see other projects, just as another example here being like the Grand Theater gets renovated. It has, been sitting there for half a century, and it's not being used for the vaudeville acts that it was originally built for. So refurbishing it, reinvigorating it by bringing it and making it a staple of the community in the downtown area is a big part of that. Now, sometimes they're successful, other times less so. And for this, in the 1990s, one of the examples is the Wausau Century Project, which and this is a larger topic. I started to dig into this morning and realized, ooh, we'll have to come back and maybe talk about this in some capacity, because it really, really is interesting and I think relevant to the modern challenges that the cities like Wausau are having today. But yeah, the Century Project was an attempt to try and again reinvigorate the city. This was sort of the marquee project. In the 1990s, I think 1997, this kind of comes to a head. Basically, the idea was, let's build on the river there. You can see the library kind of back here. So this is kind of, on the other side there, along the river. Let's build a big convention center. Let's follow the examples of successful convention centers in places like La Crosse, for example. And, or in fact, they ended up producing, to try and get the public on board, a video. Let's see, is this backwards? No, Tale of Two Cities, which is actually kind of confusing if you don't know the context, because it doesn't actually set anything up as far as I could tell. It just kind of drops it in and talks about two other a place in Minnesota and a place in California, of their successes in the 1990s in building a convention center. Whether or not it actually would have been successful or not, it doesn't end up happening, as you may know from the fact that there isn't a convention center in that same capacity. It did get pretty big. There was an attempt. Ultimately, it went for a referendum, but whether or not the referendum was going to actually do anything, because the city council was hesitant to commit to whatever the voters said. There's a whole story here, but ultimately, this multi-million-dollar development doesn't end up happening in that same way. But one of the other things is the Wausau Century Project was a larger kind of grouping of things. And throughout the 1990s, there was other attempts. This is an early one saying, hey, some caution about it, but, talking about, hey, we'd love to build get a developer to build a $5 to $6 million office tower somewhere downtown. And obviously that, turns into a different thing. It doesn't end up happening in the 1990s, but local businessman Dick Dudley kind of jumps onto this and builds the tower, which, or first Wausau Tower, I guess is sometimes known. Kind of colloquially, the Dudley building, the Dudley Tower. And this has become, a bit of a landmark, right, for the community. 11 stories, big central location. I mean, interestingly, back in 1922, a century ago, they were talking about, hey, a modern office building would be really great to try to get people to come to Wausau, and keep them here, keep businesses and services and stuff. And obviously, this is not what they necessarily intended when they were talking like that, but still. This ends up becoming maybe a success story from this. And to an extent, like the Jefferson Inn kind of fits some of the mold of the convention center sort of idea, the hotel side of things. Again, won't necessarily delve into that. But one of the interesting things is it did influence in 93 when they were building renovating or replacing the public library. This is the old building, which with the additions that many people still probably remember. But eventually we get, the modern one built in the 90s. And part of the idea here was that, if we go back to, no need to see Wausau anymore. So part of the reason that the building here opens up this way was there was going to be sort of an area, and then they were going to build the convention center. And so this the parking lot ends up going there and it works out, but the actual orientation of the public library was influenced originally by an attempt to try and make it part of a larger renovation. And the sort of reinventing of the river area, the river walk, and the 400 block is another great example. Hey, the buildings that had been built there back in the 50s were in disrepair, and we want to find a way to reinvigorate this area. So the idea of making a park came up, and ultimately, what does that look like? There's some back and forth. Do we want to do this or that? And this is what we ended up with, which is a real asset. I would say that generally people would agree with that. Whether that's the concerts on the square during the summer, or ice skating during the winter, or whatever else it gets used for events and things like that. This is a real asset. So again, this wasn't like it's a later development that happens during this period. This area is a great resource for the city of Wausau, and so we need to find ways to keep it relevant, even as maybe we don't have a mall anymore. That's probably never going to be a thing that's going to be in the way it was in the 1980s. But finding ways to do that is part of the thing. The other thing I want to point out here is the public library is kind of fits in the mold here of the this era too, because this is where a lot of the early resources, for example, how many people, this image is from Wikimedia, so from like the Wikipedia's branch of sort of media library. A lot of people learned about the internet, in the 1990s, for example, at the library or other places too. Very much one of these big changes that ultimately, again, going back to the demise of the Wausau Center Mall probably has a great deal to that as shopping trends and things change and people end up moving in different directions in terms of what we, where we do our shopping. And maybe that means us here in Wausau, maybe that just means nationally, Sears doesn't do very well. And eventually, when the anchor store closes, what do we do now? Speaking of Wikipedia though, Wausau's on the internet. 2004, Wausau gets a Wikipedia page. This is actually sort of, I went back and found the original entry that was added, and this is what it was on February 1st, 2004. It's been developed a bit since then. I actually kind of wanted to try to go back and see if I could find any examples of, local, and maybe watching this have a suggestion of something local on the internet in those early years. But I think one of the other things that Wausau certainly in that early years is it's really the connectivity of the wider world. You can go on the internet and end up in a chat room with people from other countries on the other side of the globe. You can email and all of these new exciting things. And of course, as time goes on, become more savvy with the internet, becomes more more people have access to it. In part because of smartphones, for example. When you can pull up the internet and social media pages on your phone, it becomes much more accessible to a larger group of people than if you have to set up a modem and all that fun stuff. And yeah, eventually, I think today, around this time, we start to see things like Facebook, right? Everybody's on Facebook at some point. And groups, communities start to emerge on the internet. And again, this is one of the examples that is still very much relevant. This is a group here for representing Wausau on Facebook. If you're from Wausau, which I think, if I remember right, started as a bit of a meme kind of thing, but it has evolved more from just sort of a quick, yeah, I'm from Wausau, that's true, to being a real community, a center for the community in terms of what's happening and what has happened in the past and all of that fun stuff. And so getting back to this question of how do we sum up, the history of Wausau over the last 30, 40 years, I thought, well, what is the first image that I can find that's posted online? Say, from this group. In this group, now it's worth noting that there might have been other images that had been posted. Almost certainly there were before this point, but I went into the archives, the photographs on this image, or on the group, from Wausau, and went to the very first one. And this was posted almost a little over 14 years ago, on December 13, 2008. by Kyle Patrick, and here's a picture of Dudley Tower. So I guess this screenshot kind of does represent this modern era. It's on the internet. It's something that people are, it's a forum for people to talk and to meet other people from the area. You have one of the more iconic landmarks that comes out of this era. One of the successful building development, parts of the building development. And certainly I think that the Dudley Tower is likely to be around for a while. So I think that there's a lot of legacy there. And even the fact that it's, the resolution isn't terribly large, right? But here it is on Facebook. So there you go. I don't know. Again, it was tough. There's a bunch of images that I was thinking about. I felt like I wanted something that was screenshotable, something from the internet. But again, the internet is kind of difficult. Like, how do you represent the image or an image of the internet when the internet is, you just have somebody sitting at a computer in 1996? Maybe. Yeah, why not? Let's do this particular screenshot from 2000. Well, now, but of an image posted in 2008, just after the Dudley Tower opened. There you go. So there you go. That's roughly what I decided to do today. It is a bit of a last minute thing. As I was away for the holidays, I didn't have as much time as I normally would to prepare this sort of thing. But hopefully, there's some interesting thoughts. I'd be very curious to find out if there's other images or subjects that you think might sum up the last 30 years better than this one. And do let us know if there is. This is also a difficulty here of, as a historical society, we don't often get images given to us until they're deemed historical. And so we have a lot of pictures from like the 1920s and 30s and 40s, and not so much of the 1990s and the early 2000s. So, maybe give it a few decades, and maybe we'll have a better catalog that we could draw from. But that's what we have today. So I'm just checking to see if there's any questions. I don't expect there would be, but if you have any, this is the last program for the year 2022. Little over 2 years we've been doing these, and yeah, we're looking into next year. I didn't put a graphic together for this yet, but we will be looking at bridges. So we're gonna do some bridges. You should know, some crossing into the past. But for January, some of the notable bridges: Snake Bridge, Stroller's Lane. Some of the places in Wausau and elsewhere. So more on that next week as we get into 2023, and we have some other stuff planned. As always, if there's any suggestions for topics that you'd be interested in, we do take them into account where we can, and it's always good to get that feedback. So yeah, hope you, again, thanks for watching. Just check real quick here. Hey, Scott. Says hi, Ben. Thanks for watching. I don't see any other comments, so I think maybe I will call it there. But again, thanks for watching. We'll be back next week as usual. We're not the holidays kind of fell in between our other Thursdays, so we're not necessarily taking a week off here. But that's all right. Got more history. There's always history to talk about. So in the meantime, have a wonderful new year to all of you, and we will see you in 2023 for more history.